Hello world, my name is Udira from Codarasa. Today we're going to look at ubiquitous language in domain-driven design. Let's get to learn more about it. So what is ubiquitous language? It is a language shared by developers and domain experts alike. Some things to expect is that initial consensus when you're trying to create the language will not be the end. The language will grow and change over time and you will come across breakthroughs. We'll see more about that as you go on. Typical to any other language. For instance, if I'm going to give an example of a language, it's not an official language, but we have a language in Kenya called Sheng, where it's more of the urban Nairobi language, and it's a mix of English, Kiswahili, many other languages in Kenya, and that keeps evolving. Like 10 years ago, the language is way different from what it was now. That's typical to normal languages. People will find terms that work better and then they'll pick those up. You'll see that's similar to what happens when you're creating a ubiquitous language. That will change over time, and that's very okay because you're learning more as you go. What can you expect when creating a ubiquitous language? When starting out, the language may start with terms specific to domain experts. Remember, we are getting most of this knowledge from them, so we will tend to use their terms and their way of doing things before we even establish something that works for now the project itself, the project we're modeling for. Another thing is that, of course, I've mentioned this, that the language will grow over time, so don't feel stuck to what the notions you've already created while you are starting out or in the middle of the project. It will likely change, and that will happen a lot. Another thing to expect is that domain experts may disagree on terms and definitions. Remember, when gathering domain experts, you're getting people who are specifically experts in this field, and sometimes they serve different roles in the organization, so they have that different understanding of different terms. They also are interfacing with these projects in different capacities, and because of that, they will bring their specific bias from their field of expertise. Expect that there will be those differences that you'll have to iron out as you go. So those are some things to expect. Let's look at the process of developing a ubiquitous language. What do you do when you're trying to develop a ubiquitous language? For one, open discussion. You'll need to have a lot of open discussions because you're trying to unearth a lot and you're trying to understand a lot, ask a lot of questions. Look at existing documents. This can be documents around the project. Maybe you have some things already there, you can work with that. You can also look at industry documents. For instance, if I'm modeling for a shipping industry, I may need to read a lot on what's already the standard, how the systems work. So all this will help you when developing a ubiquitous language. You'll also need to seek to uncover business tribal knowledge. What is business tribal knowledge? This is the type of knowledge that it's known by the specific few. So try to unearth that. Try to get those people who were even there when the company started, who may know secrets. They're not per se secrets, but who may know information that not everyone knows. So try to get that. Such information will help you develop your language better because you basically have information, all the information you need. You understand how some things came to be, how some processes came to be, and that will help you in the developing of the language. You can also reference standards. This can be project standards, industry standards. Again, this will help you. And last but not least, look for better fit all status quo terms. For instance, if we're used to calling something class and we want to now maybe call it grade for some reason, try to find ways that better fit what you're currently modeling for and where you are at as a business. Maybe, for instance, the curriculum has changed and now they're calling it a different name. So you may want to fit that and not use what was already there. Something like that. This was an example specifically to the school management system, but again, keep getting better fits. I'm trying to look for a good example, but you may maybe have an ambiguous name starting out for something, and then with time, as you have more language around it, then you'll find better terms to call it, and there will be terms that fit both for the developers and also the domain experts because it feels more natural, and you'll only get that as you keep talking and having more discussions around it. You also need to consider common terms and actions of the model in the domain in question. If I'm in the insurance industry, I'll need to get all the vocabulary I can get around it, of course within the project limits. So get that, use those terms, and over time you will maybe end up continuing to use most of those terms, or you'll even find better ones. That's one place to start when you're developing it. Write the terms on a board. Keep doing this so that you keep noting what are things that are standing out, what are things that are feeling fishy, maybe is this term a really good fit. Not all these things. You'll need to understand so that you even understand in future why we went with this instead of this. That's one way. And then note phrases the team uses when talking about the project. Those are things to note. You also need to discuss the terms with domain experts to refine them. Again, for instance, I said they could be in disagreement, or they could even be explaining something, but they are also coming from their own sort of closed industry expertise and really struggling to relay that information to the developers, or the same way developers will come with technical jargon. So in that case, really seek to refine and really seek to understand. Some things may feel like common sense to them, whereas they're not common sense to you. So push until it feels like you're speaking a common language. Let's look at how to create the ubiquitous language. You can start with drawing pictures of the conceptual domain and label them with names and actions. You can also use a different kind of documentation. It can be informal drawings of the important software concepts. If a glossary is not a good fit, drawing, use whatever tools you actually already have. Draw.io, PowerPoint. It would be nice to gather all these people in a room and discuss it, maybe on a whiteboard or something, but use whatever fits for the team. What you have is the best thing to start with anyway. Create a glossary of terms with the different definitions, with very simple definitions that you've all agreed about or you've agreed with as a team. This will help everyone understand what everything is. And if something needs to be changed, make sure that's also effected as soon as possible so that you don't have a scenario where you can't keep track of, oh, that was the meaning last week and then it has changed. Make sure you have all these updates and up to date where everyone is also clear that something has changed. You don't get to be changing things and people are now caught off guard by that. Frequently review the glossary with the rest of the team to keep refining it. Avoid ceremonies that bog down the discussion. Let's say you're used as developers to maybe using UML diagrams. There's nothing wrong with bringing them here, but avoid them because you're trying to get a lot of information from the business experts, and if you jump to technical, then there will be that struggle because they're also struggling to understand what you're meaning. They don't even understand what UML is, what it's about. So avoid such ceremonies that are now creating more of bottlenecks, and then just focus on easy language, easy diagrams, easy whiteboards, sticky notes, anything that moves the discussion along, because that's the priority, moving the discussion along. And this is because they can stifle the creativity of the language. You're also limiting the fluency of these people are talking. You're limiting the openness of people because someone may be thinking, oh, I don't know that. Do they even really need me in this discussion? Is this something like this is also annoying to me? They're wasting my time. Why am I now trying to understand their way of doing things, yet they want information from me? Apart from the glossary, you also need to note alternative terms. These are terms that are coming up that could be substituted. So note them. Don't throw them away yet because you may end up coming back to them later. So keep note of such. The ones that show promise, note that. You also need to note the ones that didn't show that they didn't work, they were not a good fit. And you also need to note the reason why they didn't fit, because someone may bring it up later and you're like, oh yeah, we didn't go with that because of this and this, and it's a better way to know how you came here. If someone comes in later, then because that will happen, or maybe they were not in one of the meetings, then they can understand how they got here. And maybe it can even be brought back where someone is like, I feel like this is a good fit because of this. Then again, more and more discussion. There's no closing of this, as long as you're actually continuing to improve it, not complicating the process, of course. With time, you'll develop reusable phrases for the language because you're being forced to speak in the domain language. You're being forced to speak in that business language. It can be a more complete sentence, a more explanatory, like anyone can even come and read the code and understand even if they are not a developer. This is a good advantage of domain-driven design, but focusing on the ubiquitous language, then we have a language that will easily be translated to code and it will be very effective at the end of the day. The goal is to force additional language terms and phrases to come up, so don't be comfortable with getting the one. You may even be discussing and maybe a domain expert realizes a weird term coming up and they feel like it's misplaced, then clarify. Sometimes domain experts may be talking about something and the developer keeps feeling like there is a mismatch around there. Have all these additional terms and phrases, have these better language. Sometimes some things don't even feel like they're fitting. Again, have these pop up at this point. Do not optimize too early. You can see why this is the case, because you want to keep improving it and getting the best fit at the end of the day. You also need to remember that you won't always agree on the captured linguistics, and that's very much okay. That is part of the process. Be agile and be okay with editing heavily. Be okay with throwing away all you've known and just let's pick a new way of doing things. Of course, that won't happen, probably not, but not everything at least. But be okay with making a lot of changes around this process, because it's the best. At the end of the day, that's the only way to totally get everything right. All these, the sketchbooks you have, the diagrams, those are not the model. They're just the genesis of the ubiquitous language. It's how you start expressing it. It's how you start talking about it. The ubiquitous language expands and morphs over time. You can see how this happens. The drawings and documents don't express this reality. Team conversations and the model in the code are what will stand the test of time. Remember, you're having many more discussions around it. Using those conversations, maybe you can record them, maybe you can even update the existing documents after the conversation. Sometimes it may feel like a lot of work. Team conversations and the actual code is now what is going to stand the test of time. So it may be the most high chances that that's the most reliable, updated version of the model. That's why it's very important to have these updated as often as possible. Sometimes you may do a lot of effort trying to update documents, and at some point it may feel like a lot of work, so be aware of that. That's why it's very essential to have the same language in the code, because at all times you don't have to now maybe use the documents to now translate what the code meant. Because of this, team conversations and the code are the most guaranteed way to verify the ubiquitous language. It's the most current notation of it. You should be okay with throwing away the glossary, the documentation, and the drawings you had, because that will keep morphing over time, and sometimes it will be a lot of work keeping them. Anything really that will be hard to keep up to date with the ubiquitous language and the source code's rapid growth, be okay abandoning it, and that's part of the process. I'll give a quote here by Von Vernon. The ubiquitous language is a team pattern used to capture the concepts and terms of a specific core business domain in the software model itself. If you don't know, Von is one of he wrote the Red Book. Yeah, the Red Book in terms of domain-driven design. We have the Red Book, which is by Von. We have the Blue Book, which is the original book on domain-driven design by Eric Evans, and there's so much more. If you want to read a lot more, get lost in their books. I would really recommend them. You will learn a lot. It's a beautiful world. I really like domain-driven design. These are some of the things that will be incorporated in the software model. You'll have the nouns, you'll have the adjectives, you'll have the verbs, you'll have richer expressions formally and spoken by the close-knit team. These will all be contained in the software model ubiquitous language rules. Ideally, always have one ubiquitous language per bounded context. Remember, the bounded context is housing the ubiquitous language, so it doesn't make sense to have more or have one ubiquitous language covering two bounded contexts. Another rule I can think about is that bounded contexts will be relatively smaller than we initially imagined. Sometimes you can think of something being really big, and then after all this process and all this unearthing and learning a lot more about the project, about the model, then you find it will be smaller than you actually anticipated at the start. Another rule is that the language is ubiquitous only within the team working on the project, within the bounded context. Another thing to note is that other bounded contexts in the domain should have their own ubiquitous language, even when we find that terms overlap or have similar meanings. A good example is going back to the school management system, where I was talking about. Please reference the bounded context video if you want more details on bounded context, in case this is confusing. Back to my explanation. When we could maybe split in a school management system, we could have a school bounded context, we could have a teacher bounded context. And in this case, in the student bounded context, we'll have details on the teachers that serve this student, like the teachers that teach this student. That can be some of the information we put in a student bounded context, but not details on the teacher. Yet teacher means the same thing in this sense. Ideally, in this case, it does mean the same, but they should still have their own separate bounded context, even in this case when the meanings are overlapping. The teacher-bounded context will have its own language. The student-bounded context will have its own language. That's a simplistic explanation. I thought to use school management system because many people will understand that concepts around that, instead of maybe using something like insurance, which even I will take a long time to understand. But yeah, that's just a simple explanation. Again, according to what you're modeling, now get to see all that and know that you'll need to have other bounded contexts use their own languages even when the terms are overlapping. And lastly, using the same ubiquitous language universally will be disastrous because you're not trying to, these are different bounded contexts, they should all have their own languages. Don't try to put all of them together. A bounded context should only be large enough to house this ubiquitous language, nothing more, nothing less. That's a good way to size it. Discuss, research, conceptualize, develop, and speak the ubiquitous language as often as possible of the isolated domain model within the explicit bounded context. This process, this like reiteration of this, discussing, researching, conceptualizing, developing, dwelling, coming back, all that is what will ensure you have a very successful ubiquitous language created. Reject all concepts that are not part of the agreed upon ubiquitous language of your isolated context. So if something comes up, if you've not discussed it, if it's not still, or maybe you've discussed it and it's not a fit and it has been rejected, just keep it out of the language. And that's it on ubiquitous language and domain-driven design. As always, I am Waithera from Codarasa. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned. Until next time, bye.